Blog Talk Radio.
Paranormal Review Radio.
Welcome, everyone. It is Friday night, and you're listening to Paranormal Review Radio, the only radio show without commercials and with more great paranormal talk. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Anthony Agati in New York.
And I'm Lucy Liebfried in Chicago. You're listening to one of the highest-rated paranormal radio shows on Blog Talk. No bull, no lies, just a true platform for everyone to share their knowledge and experiences. When searching for the truth, good communication is key. Now, the phone lines are open for questions or stories. The number to call is 661-244-9831. Make sure you press the number 1 to get into the queue. We'll try to get to you as soon as we can. Otherwise, the chat room is open so you can post any comments or questions there as well. Don't forget to like us on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel at Paranormal Review Radio. You'll find more articles, blogs, and full show uploads. And if you have specific questions, comments, or would like to be a guest on the show, email us at paranormal.review@aol.com. Now, sit back, get comfy, and prepare to open your minds. It's time for Paranormal Review Radio.
You may be wondering, what the heck is tonight's show about? Satan? Occult? On Good Friday? Well, hold on. There's actually a really good reason why. Author George Case has written many books, such as Jimmy Page, Magus, Musician, Man, Out of Our Heads, Rock and Roll Before the Drugs Wore Off, Calling Dr. Strangelove, and several other books. Has published a new book, Here's to My Sweet Satan, How the Occult Haunted Music, Movies, and Pop Culture. A sweeping and masterful cultural history that tells how the occult conquered the American imagination, weaving together topics as diverse as the birth of heavy metal, 1970s horror films, the New Age movement, Count Chocula serial, the serial killer Son of Sam, and more. Cultural critic George Case explores how the occult craze permanently changed American society, creating the cultural framework for the political power of the religious right, false accusations of satanic child abuse, and today's widespread rejection of science and rationality. An insightful blend of pop culture and social history, Here's to My Sweet Satan lucidly explains how the most technological society on earth became enthralled by the supernatural. Don't worry, we're not worshiping Satan tonight, only delving into the topic of the occult in pop culture history. So relax, religious fighters, and put your pitchforks and your crosses away. Let's give a warm welcome to George Case. Hi, George. Welcome to the show.
Hi there. Thanks for having me.
Hi, George. Welcome.
Hi.
You know what? I have to say, the title of this book really caught my eye. It was catchy. It was appealing. Here's to My Sweet Satan, How the Occult Haunted Music, Movies, and Pop Culture, which I believe is the first book to fully document the occult craze from the 1960s and 1970s. So how would you summarize your book to explain its meaning and its purpose?
I would summarize it as a social history of the occult phenomenon of that period, starting from about 1966 and going to about 1980. I'm not trying to debunk it, and I'm not trying to prove it. I'm trying to consider it as something that happened across society that a lot of people were into through a lot of different means, whether it was books, movies, music, toys, games, and real events that happened around that were in the news at the time. So it's a social history first and foremost, and it just happens to be about the occult popularity that took place over those years.
Well, you've been described as an acknowledged authority on the band Led Zeppelin.
Right.
And which personally, I happen to think they're the greatest rock and roll band ever. Okay.
Great.
But it's actually led you to write several books on them as well, as include this band in this pop culture occult craze book. So, how has the band shaped your writing?
Well, the very title of this book, Here's to My Sweet Satan, is an allusion to a supposed backward message that you can hear in Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven. Now, this is one of those urban legends that sort of took shape during the 70s after the record came out. And to be clear, it had nothing to do with the intentions of the band. There are no purposefully put backwards messages on Stairway to Heaven. But a lot of people did play the record backwards and hear this mysterious, spooky sound that came out of it, and this is how they interpreted it. And to me, that was kind of a way of taking off on the whole subject by looking at this one urban legend, the whole backward masking myth, and it really applies to so much else that was happening at the period where the public in general were sort of projecting their own fears, their own hopes, their own weird theories on all kinds of material that was already out there. And I thought, because I know about Led Zeppelin and I can write about them and I know where their music came from, that was a good place to start, good title for the book. And I think everyone can sort of recognize when they hear that, Here's to My Sweet Satan myth, they know that it's about rock music, but it's also about the way we think about putting our own fears and our own ideas on a lot of mass entertainment that's already out there.
Well, as I mentioned to you before, I really did love the book. I read it from cover to cover, and when I'm reading it, it's like all these details and memories came back to me.
Good, that's the idea.
Well, I just want to ask you, was this your goal when you set out to write the book?
Yeah, I mean, I was born in 1967, so I was a kid when a lot of this was happening, and I remember all this. I grew up with these stories about backward masking and demonic possession and poltergeist and the Bermuda Triangle and Chariots of the Gods and Bigfoot, Charles Manson, Helter Skelter. Like, all this stuff was just in the air when I was growing up, so I was kind of immersed in it like anyone of that age. And now, as an adult, writing about it from a more mature perspective, I can look back on it and I can remember all the little details and all these little stories that anyone who lived through the time would probably recall. But I'm trying to write about them with a little bit more of a detached perspective. I'm not a kid anymore. I'm not sort of spooked by it, but I certainly remember how popular they were and how entertaining a lot of it was. Like, it really did change how people think.
Well, George, it seems that the occult craze and its influence in pop culture and media is sort of like an intricate web that's weaved, but sort of difficult to define. How did you tie all of the different aspects into pretty much what seems to be a sort of well thought out and easily readable history of the movement?
Well, at first I broke it down into the different mediums that it was expressed in. There's a chapter on music, mostly rock music. There's a chapter on books, like Rosemary's Baby, The Exorcist, The Amityville Horror, the first books from Anne Rice and Stephen King. Then there's a chapter on movies, which was, again, Rosemary's Baby, the movie, The Exorcist, The Omen, The Amityville Horror, Race with the Devil, all those movies that came out in the 60s and 70s. Then there's a chapter on entertainment for kids, including Dungeons and Dragons, Ouija boards, comic books. Then there's a chapter on the so-called scientific or factual unexplainable phenomena that was highlighted during the era, like the Bermuda Triangle, Bigfoot, the Mothman, Loch Ness Monster. And then there's a chapter on the real crimes and real events that happened at the time, like the Church of Satan, Charles Manson, David Berkowitz, the son of Sam. So by breaking it down into these different categories of the media of what was happening at the time, I was able to show how much of it was kind of echoing and referencing each other. Like, for example, I'll give you one one sample. Tarot cards were very big. Well, there's a tarot card on the inner sleeve of Led Zeppelin 4, which features Stairway to Heaven. David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, was a fan of Rosemary's Baby and Black Sabbath. So you can see how all this stuff was kind of bouncing back and forth, ricocheting off each other, like a band was influencing a movie was influencing a book. It just went on and on, so that everywhere you turned, no matter what medium you were looking at, you were getting the occult thrown at you from some perspective or another.
You just mentioned like a whole slew of things that are just amazing, and the book is amazing. But how does the serial Chocula and Scooby-Doo become in line with what you just mentioned, the Church of Satan and the Son of Sam?
Right. Well, I wanted to range from the really serious and heavy and dark stuff like murderers and church and apocalyptic churches and all that, which is pretty disturbing for a lot of people, all the way back to something very light like children's entertainment, children's serials. But the point of it is that during this era, a lot of people were sort of capitalizing on the craze for it. And so when you're talking about marketing a serial like Count Chocula and Frankenberry and Boo Berry, which were sort of these spooky cartoon characters, and Scooby-Doo, cartoon show about people finding spooky monsters and so on, you could see how the occult was reaching everyone, even kids, even in a very sort of benign G-rated form. It was just a big trend of the time. So whether you saw it in the hard news stories of stuff that was really very serious and problematic to Saturday morning TV and children's breakfast cereals, it was just something that was out there. It could be marketed as a product or it could be reported as a legitimate news story, but it was just across the range of media at the time. There was no escaping it.
Well, the book, you go from 1966 to 1980, and you delve into the history of everything within pop culture and media. Why 1966?
Well, I started in 1966. Where I started the book was on that year, and in fact it was about 50 years ago, almost this week or coming up in next month. 50 years ago, Time magazine put on its cover a big question against the black background. It just said, "Is God dead?" Now that was a really controversial issue at the time. It got a lot of attention from other media. It really scared a lot of people, and by the way, that was an issue that shows up in the movie of Rosemary's Baby when Rosemary's expecting her child. Right then, that kind of disturbed a lot of people, and it did seem to signify what was happening in the culture at the time, which was a sort of rejection of the traditional morality, traditional forms of authority like the church, the government. I mean, we know that in the 60s, by that time, there was a whole countercultural movement that was taking place related to protest and drugs and changing values. That was all happening, and I think the occult was just one other aspect of that went off in a whole other direction. Not only were people rejecting the government or their parents or hairstyles or whatever, but they were also rejecting the traditional forms of religion, and getting into the occult was just one aspect of that. So when you start in 1966 with "Is God Dead?" on the cover of Time magazine, that was a pretty big shift in people's attitudes. Now, 1966 was also the year that Anton LaVey out in San Francisco formed the Church of Satan, which I go into with the book was kind of, it was a bit of an opportunistic thing. He liked publicity. He was generating a lot of press just by being sort of titillating. It was never as big or as influential as he claimed it was, but it was certainly getting a lot of publicity at the time. Like, here's a guy with a shaven head who has these crazy ceremonies out in San Francisco, and when you combine that with all the other countercultural events that were happening at the time, the music was changing, the students were marching on campus and so on, there was a really big shift in people's ideas, people's beliefs, and people's attitudes towards authority and faith and reality, really, that was happening at the time. So 1966 seemed like a really good place to start. Also, it was just because I was growing up and I was born the next year, so I kind of remember this whole phase as something that was happening throughout my childhood and my early adolescence.
Well, okay, I might be giving my age away, but
okay.
I do remember this period of time, okay? And it was an explosion of the occult to me, Okay,
Mm-hmm.
like I said, music, books, television. We were at the end of the Vietnam War. It was a
Right.
time of rebellion. But then again, you have a portion of population that's sitting there and listening to records backwards, looking for secret messages from the devil.
Right.
What, was there one thing that you can point to that might have swayed us towards the occult?
Well, it was certainly a combination of things at the time. I think it was just the general breakdown of societal attitudes toward authority. It might have been just the whole end of World War II, the post-war era. Remember, just in the 1950s, you'd seen the rise of the beatniks, the beat culture that was kind of exploring different forms of belief, like Zen Buddhism, for example. So a lot of people were becoming more and more open to these alternative forms of reason and thinking. The occult took off on one tangent of that. I think it had to do particularly with just the distrust of authority at the time. People had sort of seen the limits of what you could do with rationalism and science, which really seemed to lead to nuclear war almost. We had the shadow of some huge superpower apocalypse hanging over us at the time. And I think subconsciously a lot of us thought, if this is what rationalism and science and tradition and order seem to lead to, which would be the possible destruction of the world, maybe we should start to turn to the irrational and the strange and the weird and the discredited. Maybe that makes as much sense, because if everything else seems to lead to this huge nuclear standoff, maybe that we've got to turn the other way and we'll find something more worthwhile that way. And when you combine that too with the U.S. space program at the time, people were sending rockets into space, and it was all done by engineers and scientists. And I think people were still looking for something unknowable, some sort of mystery to the universe that science and technology seem to have kind of finished. And you'd think, okay, we've got a man on the moon. Now what? Like, now where is the mystery, the hidden side of reality? There must be something more to just sending rockets out to our nearest planetary neighbor. Let's find something that we can't figure out, something that science cannot answer. And I think that was one of the big appeals of the occult. It was sort of a return to these old, very primitive superstitions and people looking for maybe there's something to them after all, since we've kind of exhausted what we can do with science.
Well, in the book, you do mention like these occult shops that popped up everywhere. And
oh, yeah.
You mentioned the occult bookstore in Chicago. And
right.
I spent a lot of time in this store, okay? There was a pull to it, and to me it wasn't anything dark. But you had books, you had tarot cards, you had all of this knowledge that I'd never heard about, and here was this one place where I could learn about it. So was this something, was the rest of the world, do you think we were ready for something new, something unknown, with all these factors that you've mentioned? Was this a time, like possibly the beginning of our awakening?
Yeah, I think so. Well, when you throw in stuff like astrology at the time, which really took off, tarot cards, crystals, meditation, there was a lot of ways people were exploring that were sort of alternate forms of understanding. It seemed as if we'd had enough of science and rationalism and facts, and there was a real appeal to some, like I say, mystery, or even ancient traditions like Wicca, for example, which started to rise again during this period. I think people wanted to turn back to what they saw as the old ways, maybe the better ways. There was a sort of return to primitive forms of knowledge, of belief, of understanding, which seemed to make as much sense. I mean, when you looked around at the world of the time, as you said, it was the Vietnam War, there was Watergate, there was inflation, there was a lot of problems in the real world. And, of course, it sort of drove people, or a lot of people anyway, into the idea that maybe we can address these not through what we've been trying all this time, which is science and rationalism and technology. Maybe we should go the other way to spiritualism and intuition and belief and faith. Maybe that'll bring about the changes that we want, because these other ones simply aren't really solving any of our problems.
Well, you mentioned 1966 as sort of like a pivotal point, basically a pivotal point in explaining this movement and in explaining this occult craze. And in reading the book and getting prepared for tonight's show, I read a lot of history, and I try and go back to try and see if there's any other topics that I can bring up. And one of the things that popped into my way as I was researching was the era of silent films, and even the years prior before that. Many of the silent films and even the households around that time and before that time, before entertainment was available, people would dress up in their households as monsters and ghosts to entertain themselves. There's many ancient and not ancient but vintage photos of that, and also too in ancient history. Many cultures were sort of fascinated with the idea of the dead and creating the symbolism of either demonic or angelic figures of that sort. Do you feel that this occult craze is more a 19th century and 20th century and possibly 21st century thing, or is it just a repeating cycle that sort of goes throughout the centuries over and over again?
Well, yeah, that's something I do make clear in the book, that this wasn't the first time this happened. There was a sort of occult revival in the 19th century. There was an interest in spiritualism and seances and table tapping and people wanting to communicate with the dead. So this wasn't the first time people got interested in this stuff after centuries of science and rationalism, absolutely. I think it does seem to be something that sort of recurs in waves over time. And it came about in this case, the period I'm writing about, in the 60s, right after a whole series of dislocations. We had World War I, World War II, the Cold War. Like, there was a lot of sense of frustration or disorientation among the public. And as I said before, they were sort of wondering about, well, there's got to be some other answers besides what we have now. So people were turning away from the reality that was sort of in front of them and thinking maybe there's another way to address our problems, to think about our place in the world, our place in the universe, rather than what we have right now. But I would certainly agree that, yeah, it had been tried before over time. I think what was unusual about the occult craze of the 60s and 70s is that it happened at a time when we just put man on the moon. We'd had nuclear power, we had television, we'd had airplanes. It was a very, and still is a very technologically advanced society, and yet here were people returning to these ways of thinking that went back to the medieval times or even earlier. So there was such a contrast between what occult fans thought and the nature of the society around them, which was so based on technology, and here were people thinking about spirits and devils and stuff that really seemed to belong to a whole other era of humankind. And I think that is something that does seem to recur over time. So no matter how based in reality or how advanced our society becomes, there's still this pull to something that's either irrational or something that seems mysterious or magic even. I don't think we really shed that yet, and it'll probably happen again.
Yeah, it seemed. I noticed it even after 9/11 happened. That folks started to sort of question their faith or question the idea of what the afterlife was, and you saw a lot of different types of spiritual movements pop up after 9/11. Either people returning to their faith stronger, or trying to go elsewhere to try and I guess alleviate the pressure. I guess it may be related to. It's a sort of a societal impact, a huge impact that happens. People start to then question and try and find a release or a relief to whatever pain they're feeling.
Right. And I think sometimes that leads people, sometimes faith and belief can be a real catharsis for people. Other times, and I go into this in the book, it can lead to some sort of non-constructive thinking, and it turns into conspiracy theories or all kinds of weird suppositions that just have no basis in fact. And that's one of the legacies, I think, of the occult boom of the 60s and 70s, is that today you can say or think or express just about anything, and somewhere someone will take it seriously. Doesn't matter how untrue it might be or how ungrounded in evidence. There's people out there who will think, oh yeah, that could be. So no matter how wild your speculation is, we're willing to suspend our disbelief for that. And I think that's because of what happened during the occult craze of the 60s and 70s, is that so much was expressed that seemed far-fetched but was presented in such a realistic way, like things like demonic possession or the Antichrist, that the way they were shown in The Exorcist or The Omen was so convincing, so compelling, that nowadays you can say almost any kind of fantastic story, and there are people who want to give that some credence just because no one wants to say no, it couldn't happen, because hey, maybe it could. And people, I think, are attracted to that side of the irrational or the implausible.
Was there a reason why you sort of ended the book at around 1980, or are you planning to write a second book, or was there something specific reason why you ended it at 1980?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I went to 1980 because a number of things happened then. Just as I picked 1966 as a good spot to begin, 1980 seemed a good time to end. In the first place, that was the year Ronald Reagan was elected president of the U.S., and that did suggest that there was a sort of conservative backlash that was arising during that time. Just before he was elected, in 1979, you had the rise of the moral majority group, which was taking a big stand against things like rock music and so-called permissiveness. Like, there was a real backlash against what the occult seemed to represent, whether it was astrology or superstition or devil worship. That was provoking a pretty serious backlash. And then after 1980, or around that period, that was the eruption of what was called the Satanic Panic, where a lot of people were being accused of doing all these terrible devil-related things to children, and there was all these stories about daycare centers that were secret scenes of satanic ritual abuse. So it did turn into a pretty serious news story of the era following 1980, where there was this big backlash against everything that you'd seen in the previous decades, like The Exorcist, The Omen, Rosemary's Baby, Black Sabbath, heavy metal. All that stuff seemed to provoke a kind of reaction from the part of the religious right, or the traditional fundamentalist Christians, who are now saying, we've got to put a stop to this, or we've got to stamp the devil out. And what had been previously just kind of really entertainment, movies and music and books, was now treated as this sort of dangerous thing in society that we had to eradicate. And in some cases, it led to, legal persecution. People were arrested, people were convicted, people were accused of all these terrible things based on this kind of medieval mythology that had become popular. So I thought that when you take it from 1966, when it was just beginning popular, to 1980, when the real backlash started against it, that seemed to be two good bookends for what the whole era seemed to signify. And I'll say, too, the interest in the occult didn't suddenly stop in 1980, but that was when you had a real reaction against it start to get rolling.
And I also noticed, too, that there were a lot of, during that time, I think pretty much the beginning of 1980, there were a lot of talk shows that popped up and started to, create that culture that anything that had to do with this was, created in a negative way, and you were sort of the stepchild or the outskirt of what what is the norm,
Right. Well, you had the war on drugs taking shape at that time, so there again, like anyone who's a little different or weird or interested in some sort of alternate forms of thinking was now the target of criminal prosecution, and that did spread out to people who were interested in Wicca, for example, or alternative religions or the New Age. Like, all that was becoming, at least in some quarters, kind of suspect. And you had people, even up till recently, you've had people detecting satanic influences in the Harry Potter novels, or in different, or they see rock stars like Madonna or Jennifer Lopez or Taylor Swift making secret satanic hand gestures. Like, there's people looking for this stuff everywhere now because it has been so popular. And there is this strange backlash that's still out there, finding all kinds of nefarious influence in really what's just entertainment. And no one really thinks that, or no one should think that there's satanic messages in rock and roll music, but there is a small sector of society that wants to look for it and sees it everywhere, and it creates this kind of division that we seem to be seeing today.
Well, okay, music. It's always mentioned the devil or witchcraft, okay? The blues, they have many references to making a deal with the devil, going to the crossroads or voodoo. So now all of a sudden we have bands like Zeppelin, we have Black Sabbath, the Rolling Stones, Kiss, and even the Beatles with obvious references to the occult. Now, this is one thing that just always struck me. Could this just have been savvy marketing to sell records? I mean, all of these bands had very intelligent members. Many of these guys were very well read. Could this have been marketing to sell records? Or do you find that some maybe really have gone over to the dark side and tried to take the public with them?
I would go with your first assertion. I think a lot of it was marketing, and there's no doubt that a lot of these people in the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, they were well read. They were thinking about what they were writing. They had good ideas. They were certainly very original, but they also knew it was a very competitive field, and they knew a good gimmick when they had it. And if it sold records, they were perfectly happy. I go into the backstory about Black Sabbath, for example, and they did a lot of songs that seemed to be about the devil or the occult or hell or whatever, but they were the first ones to admit that they were not devil worshippers. They did not take it really seriously. They were professional musicians in a very competitive field, trying to reach an audience. They had found a sort of trick that seemed to work, and they were going to play it for all it's worth, but they weren't seriously promoting the occult. And the same with someone like Alice Cooper or the guys in Kiss or AC/DC with their little devil horns and Highway to Hell and everything. I mean, it's great entertainment. I do enjoy that music myself, but there was never any serious orchestrated attempt on the part of any of these bands to turn their listeners into devil worshippers, and most of them actually rejected that idea pretty firmly. Like, they came out and said, no, we're musicians, we want to reach an audience, we like this music, but it has nothing to do with any intentions, and certainly not to the extent of putting backwards messages on their music.
Okay, but let's talk about Jimmy Page, okay? There's always been this story that he sold his soul and the souls of Robert Plant and John Bonham to the devil in exchange for success. Now, Page did have a fascination with Aleister Crowley. We all knew about that, but we also knew that he had a serious drug habit. And all three of these guys had negative experiences. I mean, Plant lost his young son, Bonham drank himself to death, and Page had that drug addiction. All of this, I mean, all of us, all of the fans would talk about, there was a belief that there was a curse on the band. And a lot of the fans really believed this. So, I know a lot of people, and I've done it myself, where you play, Stairway to Heaven backwards. And people would say, you could, the phrase, the title of the book, Here's to My Sweet Satan. Yeah. Do you think Page really had a connection with the dark, or did drugs fuel his persona?
I think, it was probably, he was a rock star. He was an intelligent guy. He was, first and foremost, he was a musician. He wanted to make music. He was a performer. He was an entertainer. He was a songwriter. He happened to have an interest in Aleister Crowley, and he made a lot of money that he could indulge that interest. He bought Aleister Crowley's home. He bought a lot of Crowley memorabilia. But no, I don't think he was seriously, and even Crowley himself was not what you would really call a devil worshipper in the traditional medieval sense of it. They were certainly interested in non-Christian religions and non-Christian ways of belief and ways of getting what you want out of life, but it wasn't anything like do bad or do harm or spread evil or anything like that. It was just something different. Now people latched onto it and said, because you're not promoting Christianity, you must be promoting Satanism. But no, I don't think there was any real connection between his beliefs and a string of bad luck that happened to the guys in the band. I mean, this happened to a lot of rock stars at the time. They got into drugs or they had accidents, someone overdosed, someone died, but I don't think it really had anything to do with what the things that Page happened to be reading. And he was never really promoting it in concert or in songs or anything. It was always there, alluded to. It was a little bit part of the mystique. And I think he even admitted that was just a good showmanship thing. But it certainly wasn't something he was trying to sell to all the listeners.
Well, getting on to movies, you've mentioned tonight Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist. How important are they to the occult craze in learning the history of the occult craze?
Well, I think pivotal. They were both started off as best-selling books. Rosemary's Baby came out in '67 by Ira Levin, big hit book, and then the movie followed the next year in 1968. Hit movie. Roman Polanski was the director. One of the first movies of that era, the first stories of that era, to show the occult or witchcraft or anything to do with the devil or demonism happening in the modern world. Because you have to remember that until then, a lot of times people associated witchcraft and devil worship and possession with really the Dark Ages. It was kind of assumed that this sort of stuff just does not happen anymore. It has no relevance in modern society. But Rosemary's Baby was the first novel and then the first movie to show that here it was taking place among secular people in an urban environment, people who watched TV and had telephones and drove cars, but here they were still faced with something as ancient as the idea of the devil. So that was a huge influence when that came out. And then The Exorcist, the novel, came out in 1971, and the movie came out at the end of 1973. And again, that was an even bigger hit. Same idea, though. Here you had rational people, secular people, skeptical people who lived in the very modern world, suddenly faced with this ancient idea of evil, something that seemed to have existed well before we were ever around. But nonetheless, even as they tried to pare away all the rational explanations for like psychiatric or medical or sociological or whatever, and then they were finding face to face that no, this is a real case of demonic possession. So that was enormously influential at the time, just because by showing these ancient, basically medieval ideas of what evil was and what the devil was, and showing that they could still exist in the very modern world, I think that really helped suspend people's disbelief by making it so compelling, so believable. Even if it was basically a far-fetched story, the way it was presented was enough to convince a lot of people.
Right, and it pretty much was the first of its kind, and something that the society was really not used to being able to see on the big screen, and it sort of became believable, I think, realistic more so.
Yeah, well, I mean, when you think about the previous horror movies or horror stories that were kind of the classics by then, like Dracula or Frankenstein, they were all set in Europe among castles, and it was very gothic. It seemed to be very ancient, but here was horror that was brought right up into the modern era among people recognizable from our own time, and it still looked really scary. There was no monsters or castles or cobwebs or bats. It was made to look just like something you would really encounter in your everyday life, and that was what made it so powerful at the time, that it was brought completely up in line with contemporary society, and it still looked like it was right there, like it was very believable, like this could really happen. And again, even if it was kind of stretching it and making it into, they used special effects and they used a lot of very effective storytelling techniques, but the net result was that once again the idea of demonic possession, which had been basically discredited for 200 or 300 years, suddenly had a revival, and people really did think that could be an explanation for all kinds of psychiatric or personality disorders.
Many groups and certain individuals namely religious groups, have come out over the years to curtail some of these types of movies and shows and anything within media that depict, sort of like that demonic or evil sense. But as in many cases, they sort of failed. Yes, they made a big stink. They became public. They got recognition, but it soon died. And here's where the question lies: has society, I guess, forced them back, or do you feel that Hollywood has this, and their rich executives and studios have this sort of force field around the entertainment field?
Well, I think the power of the religious right, as far as preventing people from making or seeing this type of entertainment, I think that's kind of limited. I think in societies like ours, we have free speech. You should be able to say anything you want, and if it offends some people, and maybe it does, well, that's just the kind of society we live in. We have the freedom to say stuff like that. If you don't like it, don't read the book, don't watch the movie, but don't prevent other people from doing the same. What's usually happened when there's these kind of backlashes against so-called occult movies or occult music is that it just gives them more attention. It makes people more interested. That certainly happened with protests against occult rock and roll, whether it's Led Zeppelin or AC/DC or Black Sabbath or Ozzy Osbourne or Marilyn Manson. Whenever they generate some sort of protest from religious fundamentalists, basically it drives more people's interest and makes people want to see what all the fuss is about. So I don't think it's because the executives, the producers, the people writing the checks, the people making this stuff come out are in some way protected. I think it's just that money rules over God in this case. If there's a market for the material, that's what makes it work, and no amount of protest is going to take it away. And legally, you cannot shut down something because it offends your religion, and I think that's the way it should be.
Right.
Whatever religion you happen to have. I mean, that's why we have free speech, and free speech does include the freedom to offend. And I can certainly see how if you're a fundamentalist Christian, something like The Exorcist or Black Sabbath or Ozzy Osbourne, of course that is going to be pretty offensive to you, but that's the nature of living in a secular society like ours.
Very true.
Cool. Let's talk about something offensive. I mean, we've been talking about music, and I'm going to pull it back to music just a little bit. The Rolling Stones song, Sympathy for the Devil. This, right. To me, this is a song that couldn't be more sinister in nature. I still get creepy vibes when I hear the opening notes, and usually I turn it off. But yet this is one of the Stones' best-known songs. And the Stones always had a darker reputation than the Beatles at the time. So
absolutely,
when we talk about, pushback, did the public ever rebel against this song or the Stones, or was it open arms? I mean, this one song in particular is just pretty much, when you first listen to it, it is like an ode to the devil.
Right. Well, it's certainly one of their anthems. You can hear it any time of day on classic rock radio. Somewhere, someplace in North America, Sympathy for the Devil is being played at this moment. I think, as I said with the other question, if, for everybody that reacted against it or said this is bad or this is evil or we shouldn't listen to it, there were 10 more people who thought this is great, this is a great song, let's get into it, I want to hear it again. The Stones certainly have received their share of protests, and they've had legal trouble and everything, but that was usually more to do with Keith Richards' drug abuse problems. I don't think they really have to seriously contend with anybody trying to shut them down. And again, it's just when you're that popular, when you're generating that much revenue, when you have that many people buying the tickets and buying the records, there's really not much that religious conviction can do. Even if they can make a big noise, they can make a lot of stink about it, but there's just not enough clout there to actually prevent the records from being heard or the concerts from being held. There's just too many fans outnumbering too few fanatics.
Well, case in point, even today, the Pope asked them not to play today because they're doing a concert in Cuba tonight.
Really? Well, I think if this Cuba is opening the stones, I would consider that a sign of progress. And I say, Godspeed, Rolling Stones in Cuba. Good luck to them.
Well, I want to ask you about the Amityville Horror. Now, this is a story that's still debated to this day, and the house was it was the subject of several books, several movies, and there's a portion that says this whole story was a hoax, made up to make money, and others claim that it was very, very real. Do you yourself have an opinion on Amityville?
Well, what I wrote about in the book, and based on the research I found and what I looked into, was that the one thing we do know was that there was a murder that took place in the house. Ronald DeFeo killed his parents and his siblings in the house. He really did shoot them with a shotgun. He went to jail for it. He's still in jail for it. What's also true is that the Lutz family did move into that house the following year. The house really does exist on Ocean View Drive, I believe it is, in Amityville, New York. So there is a basic kernel of truth to the story. Yes, there's a house in Amityville where a brutal murder took place and where the Lutz family moved into it. But what I read about and what I included in the book was that the lawyer for Ronald DeFeo, the convicted killer, thought about trying to get him a lighter sentence by emphasizing what he called the quote-unquote demonism aspect of the case. And he wanted to claim that he heard voices urging him to commit the murders, and that the Lutz family, who were then living in the house, sort of arranged a deal with this author named Jay Anson and came up with a story, and also with DeFeo's lawyer, to emphasize the whole supernatural aspect of the case. And whether or not they really had anything like that happen to him, it seemed to be kind of stretched, at least in their efforts to sell a story. And they did make some money off selling their story to the public. So it wasn't a lot, but it was certainly done for some revenue that came into them, first with the book and then later with the movie that came out in 1979. So it does seem to be, even though George Lutz, the homeowner, always denied it and said this was a true story, and I know there's been a whole sort of franchise of books and movies subsequently, as near as I could find, there really was no haunting of the Amityville house while they were there. And certainly people have moved in subsequently and said there's nothing happening there while they lived in that house. And there was even one bit of evidence that said some of the in the book, The Amityville Horror, he describes the weather that was happening during these various hauntings that were infesting them, and then they went back and looked at the weather patterns over Long Island in that year and found that they didn't correspond to anything that was stated in the novel. In other words, if there was a storm on October 12th, well, they looked at the records, there was no storm on October 12th over Long Island. So it looks to me like the evidence for the Amityville Horror, as it's recounted in the story and in the movie, is really pretty flimsy. The basic kernel is that, yes, there was a multiple murder committed in that house. Yes, the Lutz family did move into it and later left, but did they experience, like, the pig named Jody and the inverted crosses and all that? That seems like that was something made up for the story.
You know, it's funny because there's many people that are claiming that George Lutz actually was into the occult and would create rituals or do rituals in the home. And I guess, I don't know if it's real side effects or if they were created side effects from what he was doing, stirred up drama and stirred up incidences in the home that the kids believed were real and actual. And it's funny because the son, Daniel Lutz, actually lives a couple of blocks away from me here in New York. And, you know, I've seen documentaries and I've had talks. We've heard talks from him, you know, in regards to what he believes actually happened. And so, you know, here we have, you know, sort of another case of the occult webbing or creating this web into things. Do you think, or have you heard of that George was into the occult and possibly created that atmosphere that made it believable to at least the kids, because they're the ones that are still living now? I understand the parents have passed away, right. And that they still believe that it is true.
Well, that would be a new one to me, because that was certainly not, if that was something he was really doing, that was certainly not told in the Jay Anson book of 1977 and the film of 1979. I mean, that could possibly be an explanation for it, or it could possibly be George Lutz trying to retroactively explain how the story really happened, because after people started sort of poking holes in it and saying, hey, wait a minute, this looks like you're stretching something here, he may have gone back and changed his story. Because, of course, the original story makes it seem like it's a haunted house and that George and Kathleen Lutz had no idea what was going on. They moved into it just expecting to have a nice, normal family home, and suddenly all these terrible things started happening. So if he went back and sort of changed the story and said, or if it's a story, someone changed the story and said that, he was doing all this devil worship or, secret rituals that maybe affected the kids, well, that's kind of, changing your story long after the fact, because that was certainly not something presented in the original book, which just made them out to be sort of innocent victims of something they had no idea what they were getting into. So, I mean, I can see how kids would be influenced and spooked by parents doing that sort of stuff, but that to me sounds like it's a bit of a stretch after the fact, trying to justify what increasingly looks like sort of a story that maybe is full of holes.
Well, we talked about, we mentioned freedom of speech, and we've been talking about the occult all night tonight. Just by writing about the occult craze, have you received, any prejudice or protest or backlash just because of your revitalization of this history, of this movement, for lack of a better word?
Right. Well, the book has just come out, so, touch wood, I'll say that ironically. Nothing yet, but what I would say is if anyone wants to protest it, I would say bring them on. I mean, for me, as a writer, as a publisher, there's no such thing as bad publicity. And as I was saying about things like the Rolling Stones or The Exorcist or whatever, whenever there's people who protested these things and said this is unholy, this is bad, we should take this away, it just generates more interest. So, I'm hoping really that if anyone is basically prejudiced or ignorant enough to look at the book and think this is somehow promoting dark forces or trying to sell evil to a readership, well, they're missing the point of what the book is. This is not a pro-Satan book. I'm not trying to sell the occult or get people interested in devil worship. I'm not trying to proselytize for it. I want people to see it as a social phenomenon rather than as a religious idea, and at the same time sort of reconsider what all religion is, not just so-called Satanism, but also Christianity and Buddhism. Like, why is it that we believe in these unseen things? Why is it that we concoct these very elaborate stories about what happens when we die or what exists after we die or what's out there? I mean, it's all all religion is basically weird, and the occult is just one of the weirder examples of it. So whether or not, God is an old man who lives on a cloud or a goat person who lives in a big fire underground, like, it's all pretty strange. And I think if the Christian fundamentalists are somehow offended by what I've written here, well, it basically proves the point of what the whole book is about.
Well, you know what, George, since the show is called Paranormal Review Radio, I do have to ask you, do you believe in the paranormal?
Well, I'm glad you've asked, and I do address that in the book. I would certainly like to believe in it. I think some of the stories about telekinesis, for example, or clairvoyance, I think there's stuff out there that should certainly be investigated further. Even things like the Sasquatch or the Loch Ness Monster. Stuff like that is at least on the fringe of plausibility, and I would certainly welcome people looking into it more and trying to scientifically address it. I think the evidence as we have today doesn't really support that any things like ghosts or hauntings or unusual life forms are really among us. I don't think there's enough facts or enough serious objective research has been done. There's some certainly very provocative stories out there. There's some interesting ideas. I'm a little dubious about, is it something that can really be scientifically proven, or that we can say exists alongside us in the same way that, I mean, telephones right now. I'm talking to you on a telephone. We know electricity works and long-distance communication works. We have scientific verification of that. But something like telepathy or clairvoyance or psychokinesis, stuff like that, I think has yet to be really confirmed. I would welcome more research into it. I would never want to stop people from trying to find out and trying to objectively discover whether these things can be proven. And I think it would be, if that could be incorporated into science, I think that would be great. And I think that would open up people's minds and the possibility of how we live in the world. But is there a whole other realm of paranormal, unusual, fantastic things that we just haven't caught on to yet? I'm a little dubious at this point. But as I say, I would never want to stop people from looking into it and continuing to research it, because I think it warrants research.
Well, do you believe in the devil?
No. I mean, I think I don't believe in a guy with horns and a tail and a pointy beard who sits on your shoulder and tells you to do bad things. I think humans are certainly capable of doing a lot of good or a lot of bad for themselves, as well as a lot of good. We've seen that throughout history. And by the end of this book, Here's to My Sweet Satan, I do sort of try to sum it up that way and say that, you know, even if there really is something like demonic possession or witches or whatever, we have enough problems in the real world we need to address. Like, that really, even if Satan appeared in the White House or singing backwards on a rock album, we still have to deal with the economy or the environment or foreign policy or whatever. There's just enough things in our real lives that the devil or God can't really interfere with. And as much as I would be interested in looking into the paranormal and considering all that stuff, I think we do have to keep our feet grounded in reality, basically, just to get through our daily lives.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you know what, George, I really, really enjoyed this. Your book brought me back to some of my favorite times in history. So I do want to ask you, what do you hope that your readers take away from your book?
Well, I hope for a lot of them, I think people who certainly lived through it like I did, I hope for some of them it's just kind of a nostalgia trip. I mean, the book is meant to be really fun as well as informative, and I hope people can go back and discover all these things or rediscover things like Ouija boards and Dungeons and Dragons and a few movies and books that maybe they'd forgotten, but they can remember now and think, yeah, that really was big at the time. It wasn't just one or two hit movies or one or two hit books. It was hundreds and hundreds of all these storylines that were happening at the same time. It really was a phenomenon of that period. I'm not just sort of retroactively picking it after the fact. So I hope there's kind of a nostalgia to it, but I also hope at the same time that people sort of reconsider what it is to believe in the phenomenon, unexplainable phenomenon, and you know, what is it that makes things real or unreal? What is superstition? What is reality? What is belief? What is fact? What is science? What is intuition? You know, reason versus revelation. These are kind of big questions, but I think the occult craze of that period seemed to raise a lot of them. Like, which side do we want to stand on? Reason, rationalism, science versus superstition or paranoia or whatever. I think, and I don't have all the answers, but I think it's interesting to look at all these books and movies and music and think, yeah, they did raise those questions that we're still sort of wrestling with today, really.
Well, are you planning to continue writing about this subject or about the occult in future books, or are you going to go in a different direction?
I'm not sure where my writing career will take me. I think there's certainly more to be said about the occult, and certainly it's still big today, as we know. There's still movies and TV shows and books and now video games, internet games that are still very big. So there's no denying that it's still a potent force in society, that there are still a lot of people who believe and people who disbelieve, or people who fight over it, people who want to shut it down, people who are promoting it. I think there might be more there to write about and to think about. I don't have anything in the works right now, but it's not a subject that I've exhausted, that's for sure.
Mhm. Well, thank you so much for an eye-opening conversation tonight. An amazing author and one amazing book. Here's to My Sweet Satan, How the Occult Haunted Music, Movies, and Pop Culture by George Case. Thank you so much for coming on our show, and we hope to have you back again soon.
Well, I really appreciate your having me. I'm glad you enjoyed the book.
Thank you so
George.
much.
Bye-bye.
Have a
Take
great
it easy.
Have a great weekend.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Well, there you have it. Here's to My Sweet Satan. You can actually find that, I believe, on Amazon.com. Even if you just type in George Case, C-A-S-E, Here's to My Sweet Satan, you can catch, I think it's Quiver Books. Let me just look at it for 1 second. Quill Driver Books. That is the publisher of the book. It's actually just been released March 18th, so it's brand new. So if you guys are interested in reading all about the occult and pop culture from the 60s to the 80s, I'm sure that people who are listening to our show have probably lived during that time period. I'm pretty sure of that. I know I have, and I know Lucy has. And so I started off the show tonight stating, yes, I know it is Good Friday, but why the hell are we talking about the occult and Satan and all of this stuff? And, I've told you guys who are listening many, many times, Lucy's name is short for Lucifer, and so she is the culprit for tonight's episode. So, Lucy, what intrigued you to talk about pop culture and the occult craze?
Well, when I was going through, the usual search for guests and that, I was going through the books and I saw the cover and the title caught my eye. Come on, Here's to My Sweet Satan. And of course, as I mentioned before, I think Led Zeppelin is the greatest rock and roll band in the world. I don't care what anybody says. I just happen to think that. And this is the line that every Zeppelin fan played Stairway to Heaven backwards to hear. And it was like, whoa, so it caught my eye. The cover is something that just, it just catches your eye. Now, the second part about it is I didn't look at the my calendar doesn't have the holidays on there. So I didn't realize that it was Good Friday until after George was already booked. So I would like to state right now, on air, I am not the devil.
I'll debate that.
Even though you and my son refer to me as Lucifer.
Lucifer, there she is. No, I think it's kind of coincidental and funny that the show landed on Good Friday. But hey, you know what? We're talking about. We host a paranormal review radio show. It's bound to happen that a religious holiday we're going to talk about something like this. Either it be spirits, ghosts, or something that's sort of protested against us by any kind of religion anyway. But it was funny that talking about pop culture and the occult craze landed on Good Friday. But it was. I didn't read the entire book, but I was able to read snippets here and there. I did go over and read over some of the reviews. He's got really great reviews. There's actually, let me just see, Michael Shermer, who I'm sure everybody knows the name Michael Shermer, one of the almost biggest skeptics in the world, actually commented on his book and left a comment there. And so he is a notable author. I mean, some of his other books on Led Zeppelin, I think, are pretty amazing. From what I've heard and what I've seen online, I haven't read them yet, but I think whoever's got a place in their heart for that group should actually go and read some of George Case's books about them, because he delves into it. He's a diehard musician himself as well as an author. But this really interested me. I mean, we've had conversations similar to this topic, talking about the paranormal and pop culture and how it's interweaved into a lot of the movies and music and television shows that you see in history and now as well. But it was interesting to talk about, or to see how brands such as, Count Chocula cereal and the cartoon Scooby-Doo is sort of on the same line as Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist with the Church of Satan and, Son of Sam. You would normally never put all 6 of those in one sentence, but you actually can when you talk about the occult craze, and either it being a marketing ploy or, some sort of, you mentioned it before, awakening, but I'm not sure if I would relate that to what I'm just talking about now, but some sort of enlightenment to this whole idea, and the need to be free, the need to break away, especially in the late 60s and early 70s, to break away from government ties and the many things that the institution or the man was trying to lay on you. This is sort of a combative nature, I would say, and something that was marketable. But as I mentioned to George, this isn't new, and he has mentioned it in his book as well. There's many, and if you Google online, vintage or antique photos, paranormal ghosts, you're going to see actual real vintage photos of people dressed up odd, very strange, and you're going to say, well, wow, they had really crazy Halloween costumes. But in actuality, 90% of those photos that you see online were not taken on Halloween or any time near October. It was, family night on a Friday or a Saturday in a household down the street from where you lived in the early 1900s or late 1800s, and this is what they did for entertainment. And a lot of them, instead of, doing Mary Had a Little Lamb, they would actually want to do something a little bit more entertaining, a little more thought-provoking, a little bit more impactful, and they would dress up in these weird, crazy, monstrous horror costumes. And, obviously there was that craze. The movement happened in the late 1800s with the Fox sisters. And, that started a craze, and so therefore it made an impact on people's households and what they did and what they thought about. So it just in the conversation and in the research of George Case's book got me to research and go back into history to see, is there a repeating pattern? And I saw it, and I was able to then relay it back to my period, our period now. And when I mentioned to George about that resurgence right after 9/11, that I'm sure many of you have seen or have remembered back in 2001 and 2002, there was this huge resurgence of either, if you were very religious, going back to your church repeatedly more and more often than you normally did, or straying away from that and trying to find some other soulful handout or some olive branch that you can grab onto that you believed in but still had a meaning to you as far as the purpose of life or even the purpose of the afterlife, with it meaning angelic or demonic as well. And so you see that cycle turning again and again, and possibly being created by something impactful in society or during the time period. So it's very interesting to see how this plays out year after year and century after century, really, because you can go back to ancient times in regards to this, and how that affects society and how it affects the way that you live in the cultures that are adapted to it. It's pretty amazing, and it sort of widens that scope of how we view a lot of the things either within the occult or within the paranormal. It's a really interesting topic to talk about.
Well, one of the things that I noticed, I read the whole book, and I totally enjoyed it. I mean, to me, it was a trip down memory lane because I mean, these are my bands, and these are the TV shows that I remember. But the one thing that I kind of noticed, we talk about how, like, the paranormal, yeah, there's more acceptance of it now, but when you look at the whole picture, how the occult craze kind of like wormed its way into everything, TV, cereal, kids' toys. It just, to me, it seemed like it was a little bit more accepted than, the paranormal. The belief in Satan and the occult just seemed to be a little bit more accepted. It appeared more. It was there. And as a paranormal investigator, I mean, not everybody believes in it. We still get the eyebrows raised when you say, oh, yeah, I go investigate for ghosts. But for some reason, this subject just kind of like, I don't know, to me it seemed like it was more acceptable. And that kind of raised a question with me. I mean, again, it raises the one question that I always have: why are we so fascinated with the dark? Why is it that people want to you want to see demons and you want to have something negative? That's what it feels like to me.
Well, it's an experience that you wouldn't normally have in your everyday life, and so that crave obviously is there. We've talked about the psychological aspects of people who love to watch horror movies, or who love to play horror pranks on people, or who like to be pranked on or to be scared, either it being a book or a movie or some type of media aspect. It's that adrenaline. It's almost like a drug almost that creates that sort of instant high and that exhilarating experience for that time and moment. And so you crave it. I mean, others get that in other aspects of life, but there are many, many people who get that crave from wanting to or experiencing the demonic or the evil or the negative aspects of things. But, you mentioned before that, it was so accepted, but by who? Because it wasn't really widely accepted. It was not that it was, well, this is my opinion, not that it was accepted, but I think it was more of an intrigue or an interest of people that caught their curiosity. But I think there were many, many people, especially in the 60s and 70s, who were of the religious faith that were creating backlashes and protests and becoming prejudiced, which led to the era of the 1980s, where you then had people who were basically shunned for liking, the Aleister Crowleys, or in the same line, Black Sabbath, or any of these groups and media types, because it had that element in it, and because, I guess subconsciously for the past 10, 20 years before 1980, there was that buildup of that prejudice from the religious sector. I'm not saying that religious sectors were the most part of it, but I think that they had a heavy hand in the way that it was being created during that period of time, which led to what society then began to believe in the 1980s about the occult and about those types of outlets, entertainment outlets.
Well, let's look at it today, okay? When you look at movies and stuff, you got things like Little Nicky that makes Satan into like a likable guy. You got a TV show now called Lucifer. It's all about the devil. I mean, and people are watching it.
That's your show, isn't that your show? Don't you star in that?
Yes, it is. Actually, I wrote it, But, I mean, you've got these shows, and it's like, wait a minute, this is about the devil, and you're making him into a nice guy or a likable guy. How did we get from point A in the 60s to here in 2016 where we've got TV shows and, hey, that Satan's an okay guy? I don't get it. I mean, I really don't. And, as far as, like, going out and investigating for ghosts, I want to communicate with the other side. I don't necessarily want to see a demon, but I still feel like there's people out there that they do want to see the demon, and they do want to, I know there's a portion of the public that watches paranormal TV shows to see something demonic. Dude, I just got scratched. It's demonic. I mean, this is what they're waiting for.
How does, I should have asked George about this too, how does the Illuminati come into play? Because he did mention about, Taylor Swift and Jennifer Lopez and how people are in current day right now sort of looking at these symbolic meanings of how they, how they hold their hands or it could be something verbal that they're saying that people are believing are of the occult. But along the same lines, you hear Illuminati and being a part of the Illuminati. I know, Lucy, your son is like a fanatic about learning about the Illuminati. I don't know as much, and so I haven't delved into it. But how does the Illuminati play into this whole devil or occult craze? And would you consider them to be one and the same?
Okay, if you go and you look at the Illuminati, and this is not, I'm not saying that this is exactly what, but this is what I've gathered from everything that I hear and that I've heard here. He watches a lot of things, pertaining to this kind of stuff. And supposedly the Illuminati, is looking at this one world order, okay?
Right.
And, it's all about power. So how do you get power? Well, you work on the masses. Okay, and according to what I understand, the Illuminati feels that the average person, we are stupid. We will take anything. So what's the best way to distract you from what's really going on? If I am doing sleight of hand, I'm going to have you watch this hand, and you're not going to see what I'm doing with this hand. So therefore, all of these things like the occult and all of these sensational, like demons and devils, let's get their attention with this while they're actually doing this and taking freedoms away from us. All of this is kind of shifting towards the one world order, the breakdown of the family unit, breakdown of religion, breakdown of kind of like all of the values that we've had, morals, all of this. That's kind of like on the backside what the Illuminati or the One World Order is trying to do. So therefore, let's give them what they want. They want sensationalism. They want to be oohed and awed. So let's dangle the shiny thing. So while everybody's looking at the shiny thing, they can do what they want to do. So is all of this part of their agenda? I don't know. I don't know enough about it. I don't understand a lot of it. But it does raise questions sometimes. I mean, excuse me, like I said, look at the shows that are on TV now. Look at the things that people watch, Supernatural, Lucifer, all of these shows. Oh God, there's so many of them. I mean, the CW has a million of them. And are these things that are being put there so that we can pay attention to this and not pay attention to the real problems of the world? It's a question.
Yeah, I think, we're noticing a lot more, or this influx of, paranormal-based or demonic-based television shows because of the sparked interest, I think, that started mainly, with In Search Of back in the 70s and 80s, and Unsolved Mysteries in the 80s and such. Yes, you can say it started around there, but I really think that, early 2000. And again, was it sparked because of 9/11 and the incidents that happened, around the world? That once these paranormal shows popped up on television, that they were much more interesting because the need was there. It's all about supply and demand. And so was the need there for these television shows because people were in that direction looking in search of, no pun there, but in search of that direction to find answers and to be spooked, but yet also to validate what they were feeling. And so did these shows fill that void? I think the shows you're talking about, Supernatural and Lucifer, I particularly am not really interested in that. I'm not really interested in drama-based television or sort of that fiction type work. I'm more of a realist. Not that I love reality television, because some of that reality television is so annoying. But I'm more of like, the reality of things. I like to watch documentaries and so on and so forth that have the real depictions of things. But I don't know how that whole Lucifer thing plays into it, and that's sort of what my question was before, is this whole idea of demonic and evil tied to Illuminati, and is just Illuminati just another phase in this occult craze, or it's sort of, been pushed up a notch, and people are believing this whole Illuminati thing, because I don't know if the Illuminati exists. I've heard so many stories. I know your son can debate the hell out of me on that, and I won't get into it with him, but and I'm simply because I'm not prepared to. But it's to me it's cyclical, and I mentioned that before, that it just keeps repeating and being amped up based on the events of society at that time. And just because now we're in a more advanced technological age, that either it's being extended further because communication is so much more vast now that you can spread these things a lot quicker, and with social media, that we're keeping it on life support, so to speak, much longer than anyone would have done in the 17th or 18th or 19th centuries because of technology now. So I don't know. It's a huge web, and he described it that way, and we've described tonight when talking to him about this occult craze web that's sort of interweaved into many, many different things and many different aspects. But I don't know. I don't know what to think of things, because some things are believable. I'm trying to make sense of this. Sorry, and you're hearing it firsthand. You're probably smelling the smoke if radio or video had smell-o-vision. But I'm trying to make sense of it all, because you talked about how who was it? Was it Led Zeppelin? You were talking about the one band. Or no, was it Jimmy Page? Who are you talking about?
Jimmy Page from Led Zeppelin, probably the greatest guitarist ever living.
Right, and he had this fascination with Aleister Crowley. And whether or not he sold his soul to the devil, right? That was the question, really, or the bottom line to it. And he had a fascination with Aleister Crowley. Now, we all know that the Church of Satan has nothing really to do with worshiping Satan, and that was the interpretation, and still is, that people have about the Church of Satan. We've talked to Eric Werner, who is, I think he's a reverend within the Church of Satan. Wonderful guy. And he, on our show, explained to us what the Church of Satan is all about. And it is not a worshiping of Satan. It is more or less the opposite of Christianity, and it's more along the lines of creating yourself as the God and still living a wonderful, beautiful life with set rules and set regulations to live amongst society in a peaceful environment. But they say an eye for an eye, similar to what Christianity says, but it's mostly to defend yourself in a sort of animalistic environment, which is not far off from many people's ideology. Putting religion aside, people believe that. I'm going to defend myself. Something happens, somebody hurts my daughter, you're going to run after whoever did it and beat the crap out of them. That's similar to what the Church of Satan is all about, other than what they revel as feeling that what Christianity has depicted Satan to be is not actually true. And so they sort of create the devil, or Beelzebub, or Lucifer, Lucy, as people say, as more of a
it's a symbol.
Yeah, it's a symbol, but they create more of a life, more of a humanistic quality to him, which is almost the similar or same as God himself or Jesus. So putting that aside, though, we in the paranormal believe in many different things that the outsiders, I call them, or people, non-believers, say that we're crazy to believe, that we've seen spirits and we've seen ghosts. But could Jimmy Page, as we know there are entities that are evil, could there have been some sort of pact, maybe not with the devil, but maybe with a negative entity that created what was going on with him, his music, and his life and the people around him? Whereas George Case says, no, it's not. It was the drugs and only the drugs, and it was just influenced and created as a marketing ploy. But could he have done it? Could that have happened? Could it have been true?
Well, see, there's a lot of things like with Jimmy Page. Okay, one, yes, he did have the fascination with Crowley. And when you look at some of the albums, okay, there's one album in particular where each one of the band members have these symbols for them. And they're occult symbols. He used them quite strongly in the marketing of this band, okay? And the way I look at it, there comes a point where there's marketing, okay? And it just seemed to go a little bit further. Now, there were people in his inner circle. There was one girlfriend in particular, and I can't remember which one it was, but claimed that she was a witch, okay? There were stories all around them about, rituals and things like that. Is it part of the rock star legend that this all was? I think it was. I think it was a life of excess, and as you see with a lot of the music industry now, you take people. Okay, Justin Bieber pops into mind. Okay, here you have a kid that popular. Well, wait, listen to me. Okay, here's a kid that got popular on YouTube. He was just a dorky little kid. Now all of a sudden you're throwing money. Okay, you're throwing fame, women, all of this at, and now he's turned into like this, this thing without morals and just kind of just a low life. Okay, is this happened?
That's poor management and an asshole being an asshole. Excuse my language.
Well, okay. Could Jimmy Page just have been an asshole? Could he have just said, I'm going to do what I want to do, and I'm just going to blame the devil? Zeppelin wasn't the only band that did this kind of stuff, okay? You're talking about Black Sabbath, but just the name itself, Black Sabbath, Then you got Ozzy Osbourne, who supposedly bit the head off a bat. Well, it really wasn't a bat, it was a dove, okay? And according to Sharon, when Ozzy went into it was at a record or it was a signing for a record contract, and Ozzy had brought a dove in his pocket, and he was going to let the dove go. He was going to let the dove go right after he signed the contract and let it fly. Well, he was so drunk at the time that he picked it up out of his pocket and he took a bite off the head. That immediately turned into this legend that Ozzy bit the head off of a bat, you know.
No, well, did he do it on stage?
That was part of the act afterwards, okay? Yeah. Ozzy also peed his pants a lot of times on stage, okay? That's why he's always dumping buckets of water on him so you wouldn't see it. You're talking about rock and roll. You're talking about excess. These are guys that just they may be 40 years old, but they're still acting like teenagers. And why? Because the public loves it, because they're getting paid for it. I kind of take all of this, you know, like all the stories around Zeppelin and all these other bands, I attribute it to money. I really do attribute it to money. It's selling, okay? It's marketing, okay? You can take Kiss, okay? I don't know how many Kiss concerts I've been to, okay? Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley both were teachers before they became rock stars. And why did they go into music? Not because they were, you know, these diehard musicians. They have said it. Gene Simmons has said he did it because of girls. It was a way to get girls. Both of these guys knew they weren't that good looking, so they put on makeup. They each got this persona. You know, Paul Stanley's the star child, and Ace Frehley is the moon man. Peter Criss is the cat. And who did Gene Simmons pick? The demon. Okay. Now, when you listen to Gene Simmons and you listen to what he says, this guy is probably more conservative, more right wing than a lot of people out there. You take somebody like Ted Nugent, who, you know, Wango Tango and all this. He is a diehard conservative. These guys are so conservative, First Amendment right, freedom of speech. They're the complete opposite of what their stage persona is. So, yeah, I think it goes back to money. I think this whole obsession with the devil and all of this, it sells. Now, what does that say about the American public, the people that are buying the records? Right. I don't know. Because here you have somebody like, okay, what do they want to hear? Well, I'm going to give them what they want. They want to see devils, I'm going to give them a demon. But then again, you've got the public that is buying all of this, that are going to their concerts. Oh, my God, you go to an AC/DC concert, and I'll never forget the last one I went to, I felt like I was in hell because the things you see in the crowd are more scary than what you see on stage. You know, you've got the music going, but then you've got these broads lifting their shirts up. You've got people, you know, all with the devil, you know, with the devil horns and all that. It's like, I don't know. Is this the public's way of releasing their inhibitions, rebelling against everything? So, you know, let's say Hail Satan. Okay, is it a deep-seated need within us to rebel? I think it is. I think on the part of the bands, I think on the part of the marketing, it's all about money. But I think on the part of the people that go to the concerts, I think maybe we're so frustrated in our own lives, and you did touch about this, you know, that, yeah, so let's embrace this. You know, let's do devil horns, and let's say Hail Satan. You know, I don't know. It's something so different than everything that's been pushed on them from day one. You know, school, teachers, church, no matter what. You have to do this, and you have to toe the line. And here you have, now all of a sudden you've got a band on stage, and the lead singer or the lead guitarist is dressed up as a demon. Oh, yeah, you know, they get into it. So I really do believe it's all about money on the part of the bands, on the part of the people who listen. Yeah, some of us go because we enjoy the music. Others, I think, go because of the idea. I think, yes, they've sold the idea, and I think people embrace it. Now, why do they embrace it? I really don't think it is an embrace of the devil. I think it's more an embrace of freedom, rebellion. I think that's what it is.
I think it's the enticement or the interest that leads them to the music, but I think it's the music the music itself that is actually becoming a favored piece of entertainment to people, that they enjoy it, but yet it's that enticement of the rebellion. It's the idea of something new and different, something that my parents never did, and so, or that my parents would never dream of me to actually get into, or would hate for me to get into, and I'm going to get back at them for all that they've done to me throughout my teenage years. And so that enticement to that the other world, the dark side, as people would call it. But I think then eventually the music is something that will, because they've been sort of adopted into that world, the music then becomes of interest and becomes favorable to them. And so there's that longevity in it all. But again, what this book has done and what this conversation tonight has done has just sparked more conversation or more talk about the idea of, let's look at these things that we've known in history or that we may have lived through that you never really thought of before. You never really delved into it. You may have thought for all these years that, that's the devil-worshipping music. I'm not going to listen to that. But have you really listened to it? Have you really gone into the history of the singer, the band, the group, whomever, the music that's being played, the words that are there? Have you really got into it? Some of them probably, are not worth even researching. But I think there's a real keen aspect to understanding the occult craze and pop culture and how it's transformed your world. Believe it or not, it has. It has created what you see on television. It has created the billboards. It's what has been done in history, or what you have done in history back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s has created what you have or what you know today. And that, to me, is interesting to understand. I've always been at the forefront of understanding the paranormal, but to understand the paranormal and where you're going, and what I mean by where you're going is, what happens in the afterlife, you have to go back into history to understand the paranormal and to go back and really research all of the many different cultures and the ancient societies, all the way back to the beginning, wherever the beginning is for you or for time, and really delve into all of those aspects, because there's a lot of different pieces that, again, I say this all the time, that you may not realize are the correct piece of puzzle that fits into your puzzle. You may not realize it until you actually look into it. So don't take things for granted. I'm not saying worship Satan. I'm just saying that you should really look into a lot of these aspects. Because one of the things that I brought up tonight was when you had questioned George about Amityville, that, and I'm sure you heard this, Lucy, because we've talked about it, that one of the theories was that George Lutz, who's the father that moved in after the DeFeo family was murdered, that he was not a wizard, I don't know what the right word is, but he was into the occult, and he was doing these ceremonial rituals. And that wasn't something that he admitted as what George was talking about, or that he would want to admit, because it would then make his claims be that if the house was haunted, that he created the haunting. He stirred up the spirits in the home, and that's why it's haunted. He didn't want to be the reason why things happen, and so I think it was kept quiet. But there were other people that mentioned, because they had heard or seen or whatever, that he was into the occult and was creating things. Now, there are two sides to that then. Did he delve into the occult and stir something up, or did he delve into the occult and make it believable for his family and, you know, his children, either it be a drug-induced type of ceremony that he did himself where he believed it and sort of created it more believable for his kids? Because his kids, Chris and Daniel, both of them, I mean, I don't know so much about Chris, but I know Daniel is fucked up. Excuse my language, but he is whacked in the head, and I'm not meaning that's him. That's the side effects of what he went through as a kid growing up in that home. So did his father cause that just because his father was crazy and, you know, his sons saw this and believed things were going on because of this? Or did George actually stir up something because he delved into the occult? And that, to me, is an interesting conversation or an interesting, you know, concept to think about. Whether or not it's true or not, I don't know, and I don't think we will ever know because George Lutz is dead, and you know, Kathleen Lutz is dead. So we're not going to know really what happened, and I don't think you can get a true aspect as to what happened if you talk to Daniel. Even though I would love to talk to him, I've seen him in the past 6 months twice in the neighborhood, and I'm dying to just walk up to him and see if I can get him on the show. But we almost had him on the show. We were very close to having him on the show. But it stirred up something in Daniel. I know that for sure. That he believes till this day. He is a grown-ass man. You know, I think he's in his 50s, who is still traumatized by what happened when he was a young boy. And that, to me, is an interesting road to go down and decipher what went on there.
Well, see, I found it interesting. I found George's take on it interesting, okay? But part of me is thinking that he's looking at it from a journalistic point of view, very fact-oriented. I don't think that he did go into, like you said, he wasn't aware of the stories about, you know, the father going into the occult and stuff like that. The other part, when I forgot Miamityville Horror, that movie, that
it was a documentary with Daniel Lutz.
When you look at Daniel's eyes, when you look at this man's face, he believes truly that something happened. Now, this goes back to, like, you know, thought forms. Okay, if you believe strongly enough in something, are we creating this situation? Because, I mean, you've taken me by the house. We've driven past the house. You know, it's a beautiful, beautiful house. It looks so peaceful and so serene, and I've not once felt anything negative about this location. But is it possible that if George was into something, you know, the occult, whatever, and George himself believed it so much, that belief manifested itself into something that these poor kids actually experienced? That's something else, okay? So did they, when they left the house, did they take it along with them? Is that belief that they have, that something transpired, that all of these occurrences happened, did they take that with them? Because I don't feel like it's still in that house. And there really haven't been any reports of anything ever happening in that house afterwards. There's nothing.
No.
So,
and that leads to the idea that it was actually faked, because nothing happened after the Lutz family left that home. You know, and as George was talking about even tonight, that they checked on the weather pattern to match to his story, and they found it to not be accurate. And so there are a lot of aspects to George's story that don't ring true, especially his relationship with the author. and the whole idea that they created this story, which I know that there have been debunkers out there that have said that this is not true, which it is believable. I don't know. I can't find a stance for myself on what happened in that home, or whether or not it is haunted or was haunted. I can't say that 100% sure. I don't know. But I think the idea of this possibly being something that was created by George, either it turned out to be paranormal or not, whatever, and if the possibility is that he did something of the occult in that home, those kids believed it to be true. And to this day, as you were talking about looking in Daniel's eyes in that documentary, My Amityville Horror, there's anger there. Daniel is angry at the fact that he lived through this, or that he has this as a history to his life. He's angry. He does not want it. And to feel that frustration coming out emotionally from someone, not even verbally, but just by viewing him, to have that anger come out, to me, whatever happened, either it's true or not, something happened with that family while he was young, and I believe the father is at fault for that. Whether or not he did the occult, whether or not the occult rituals created the paranormal, either it be a thought form or actually raised them up out of the dead and brought them to the home, or the ceremonies themselves created the kids to invisibly see, if that makes sense, or see things that weren't really there, but because of what was going on, created those images in their head. Because it's a moldable child, it's an impressionable child that can create things that aren't virtually there. So there's just many questions, and I believe Daniel. I truly believe his anguish. I believe his story. Whether or not that his story is true, I don't know that, but in his world, that happened. And I can't say that Daniel is faking it. I truly can't.
I don't believe he is. I mean, to look at this man's face, he is going through something. What he's going through to this day is a result of something that happened in that house. Now, excuse me, is it paranormal? Is it demonic? I don't know. Paranormal Poison in the chat room said, okay, so what you were trying to get out, can we make Satan real to us? Can we? I think we can. I think if you believe in something strong enough that you can manifest it. I mean,
well, yeah,
voodoo.
That's religion.
Okay. Yeah, voodoo. That's the first thing I thought of. Supposedly voodoo as a religion or as a whatever you want to call it. It cannot harm you unless you truly believe in it. And supposedly if you do believe in it, yes, it can harm you. I believe in thought forms. I think they do exist. But then again, on the other hand, let's talk about Satan. Okay, Satan, do you believe in angels? If you believe in angels, why would you not believe in Satan? Lucifer was God's most gorgeous angel. And because he thought so much of himself, he was banished. He was thrown out of heaven. So here you go. If you believe in the Bible, I guess it comes down to your religion. If you do believe in the Bible, then yes, you believe in Satan. If you've got questions about the Bible, then it would go to say that you should have questions about Satan, because all of this is stories from the Bible, and we all know that the Bible has been changed so many times throughout history that it is. I don't believe that. I believe there's so many changes that the original content is almost not there. I think it's been changed so many times for different purposes, for controlling whatever section of the population the leaders were going to do. Let's change this. Let's make this, this, and this. So I think it has been modified so many times. I think the basic principle is true. because it is a story of good and evil, and being the best you can, and being good to your neighbor and to others. But I also believe that it's been changed so many times that I have a lot of questions about it.
Well, listen, I mean, bottom line, really, truly, the reason why we do these shows and the reason why we have these conversations with each other, between Lucy and I, and with many people who either call in or are guests of the show, the real reason why we do it is not to force basically anything that we're saying down anybody's throats. Anything that we're talking about on any given show that you listen to between Lucy and I is an opinion of ours. It is nothing that we say is set in stone and you must believe. Forsake, believe in it. That is certainly not what we are doing. What we do is we spew. It just comes out of the mouth of Lucy and I, of ideas that we have in our head. Either it be at the spur of the moment during the conversations that we have, or within the research that we do. And what it does, and what we hope to gain for ourselves as well as for everyone who's listening to our voices right now, is to gain an understanding that there are things that are in this world that we should research and learn more about for ourselves. How you interpret it is how you interpret it. This is your life. This is the way that you are going to be living, and it is what you are going to take with you once you close your eyes for the last time. I certainly cannot make anyone, or I certainly don't want to make anyone believe what I believe, because as we've talked before, and as George has mentioned, we can say, we can do, we can speak what we want. As long as it is not harmful to anybody else, we can do as we choose. Now, whether or not that's religious-based or whether it is just your own humanity-based ideology, it is up to you to live your life and to seek out the knowledge that you want to seek out. And if this type of conversation interests you at all, then the conversations that we have tonight and the conversations that we have on other shows, I hope, only instills the idea that you can go out and learn more about on your own and interpret and bring forth to your family, your friends, your paranormal group to again possibly find a piece to the puzzle that you may have been looking for all along. It's worth a shot. So that's what we're doing. We're not trying to... See, I told you, Lucy, people are going to think we're telling everybody to worship Satan. That's why I call you Lucifer.
Well, they already think that we're Satan worshippers. And
people think I am. People think I am a Satan worshiper.
Well, in that case, you worship me. But they are opinions, okay? So even though Anthony feels that I am Lucifer, and one of my favorite songs is Running with the Devil by Van Halen.
That's only my opinion.
Doesn't mean I am the devil. I just want to reiterate that right now.
Although that's not the reason why I think you're the devil, because you listen to that. There are other reasons why, but we won't talk about them here.
But anyway, no, it really, you know what? Bottom line, the book, even though the title, when you first look at it, you're like, whoa, it is such a great book, because it is. Like he says, he wants it to be a social history, and that's exactly what it was. He takes you through this period of time, and for me, there were just so many memories that just came to the forefront, and I loved it. I loved reliving all of that. I mean, I started listening to some of that music again, some songs that I hadn't heard for years, and I just thought it was great. It is a good book. It really is a good book, and if you haven't read it, you really need to.
See, it's funny because I wasn't really into, rock and roll younger. I mean, I liked Mamas and the Papas. I was sort of, I was on the. I hated the Beatles. Sorry, but I hated the Beatles. I was just in that sort of moment, and not so much in the rock and roll era. That's my world.
I have seen almost every band he mentions in concert.
I know you have, and so that got me to thinking: was that the only reason why you had him on the show? Was because of your personal interest in the bands?
No. I mean, there were other things. I mean, every single one of those movies. I went to see The Exorcist the first day it came out. Rosemary's Baby, when that book came out, I read it cover to cover. I think I was I was still in high school. The Exorcist, I remember reading that. And then, he talks about, like, television shows. He mentions The Twilight Zone, which is is probably your favorite.
It's my favorite,
and when you think about all of these episodes, they all had to do with the unknown. And if you ask somebody about any other television show from that era, they're not going to remember every detail. But you ask somebody about a Twilight Zone, their favorite Twilight Zone episode, and they will give you specific details. So how does something like that make such an impression on a person? And the subject matter isn't, like Little House on the Prairie. We're talking, these are unknown things. These are things that we don't know. It is the occult,
I think it's things that are, I guess to put it in a nutshell, we've got about 4.5 minutes left. But to put it in a nutshell, I think it's things that are that create an impact in your life. As you say that, the Twilight Zone, if you ask anybody, they'll say what their favorite episode was. But I think also, too, you can say that about, people who have watched or saw Titanic. I bet, they will be able to name some of the scenes in Titanic that were their favorite because it seems as though Titanic was so, I can't even think of the word, but it was almost one of the most pivotal movies in history that made a huge impact on people. And so you may not have liked Titanic. I'm not sure if you did. You like Titanic? Yeah. See,
not really.
You're not normal. You're not normal. You are Lucifer. I'm telling you, you are Lucifer.
Wait a minute. Does it mean something that I can recite dialogue from Little Nicky?
But the majority of the population would say that that they can remember Titanic and one of the pivotal scenes in it because it was so impactful. And I think that's the same with a lot of the shows and movies or music that stepped over that line and created some sort of impactful experience to any individual that was in its way. And that's what made it so memorable. I mean, Twilight Zone was, one of its kind, really, which sparked the Creep Show and Tales from the Dark Side and all of those alike, which I loved all of them. But it stemmed from the Twilight Zone. I mean, we can talk about this forever, but in a nutshell, again, I say that 10,000 times tonight, this is a really interesting topic that you can, and it is a web, as George Case has said. So if you are interested in it, do a lot more research. It can only lead to a lot more fun experiences, more fun than the fun that you had at the original time. So, Lucy, with that, why don't you get with the Fan of the Week?
Okay, this week our Paranormal Review Radio Fan of the Week is Don Gilchrist of YouTube Land. Don likes to listen to paranormal radio shows, so we were very flattered when he commented on the show we did on the Goblin Universe, and he shared the link on his Facebook page. Don commented he really enjoyed the discussion, the thoughts. It was a great subject and interesting. I have shared. Cheers, Don. Thank you so much for sharing and listening, Don.
It's funny, Don Gilchrist. There's Christ in his name, and you're Lucifer. Don't forget, if you want to be a Paranormal Review Radio Fan of the Week, just like us on Facebook at Paranormal Review Radio. And congratulations, Don.
Well, anyway, let's get to next week. We're going to take the night off next Friday night, but no worries. We're going to be back the week after, April 8th, with a show that you don't want to miss. I will give you one hint. Ever hear of a place called Gettysburg? a place that I really want us to go. So in the meantime, you can still get your PRR fix on Blog Talk, iTunes, or YouTube. All of our shows are there, so catch up or listen to one of your favorites. Thank you, everyone, for spending time with us. We love connecting with you. Thank you, Anthony, for making another Friday night very special. So until next week, Parapeeps, rock on and have a paranormal week. Happy Easter. Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Paranormal Review Radio.